In the bustling area of Mwangazi, there was a peculiar spectacle that everyone knew, admired, and sometimes feared: Katun's bus, Kanavu. Now this wasn't your ordinary bus, not by a long shot. Kanavu was old, loud, and rickety, but to the people of Mwangazi, it was a legend in its own right. It didn't just carry passengers, it carried stories, myths, and laughter. And behind its wheel was Mwatate, a man as mysterious as the bus itself. Only he could handle Kanavu. And if he wasn't around, well, Kanavu wouldn't move an inch, not even to open its rusty doors. Every day, Kanavu thundered along the plains to the west and the forests to the east, and no one quite knew how it managed. It was a market women's best friend, picking them up in the early morning with their baskets of vegetables, fruits, and gossip, only to return them safely at the end of the day, often tired but always entertained. Strangely enough, Kanavu seemed to run on magic. No one ever saw it stop at any petrol station. It roared through the rain without slipping, it rattled under the scorching sun without overheating, and it didn't seem to care if the road was paved or muddy. It simply went where it was told. But there was one thing about Kanavu that everyone in Mwangazi agreed on. It was never without Mwatate and his skinny, yellow-shirted conductor, Mwaura. Mwaura was a character all on his own, always dressed in that yellow t-shirt, so much so that some villagers swore it was stitched onto him. If you ever see Mwaura without that yellow shirt, something's wrong with the world, they'd joke. And the way Mwaura moved through the bus, collecting fares, making sure Kanavu drank from a jerry can full of some mysterious liquid, it made people whisper, half joking, half serious, that Kanavu was not just a bus. It was alive. Now, the bus was an old beast, always rumbling and coughing as it moved, creaking like it was complaining about the weight of its years. But despite all that, it was reliable. And the relationship between Mwatate and Kanavu was something else. There was a strange bond between man and machine, almost like the bus had its own moods, and only Mwatate knew how to handle them. If Kanavu acted up, say misbehaving along the steep hills, Mwatate would pull over, step outside, and flog it. Yes, you heard that right. He'd take a thin branch and give the bus a few good whacks. What was even stranger? The bus would behave afterward, almost as if it were a naughty child being disciplined. Pause, please. Are you enjoying listening to the story? Please consider subscribing, liking, sharing, and also commenting if you are still interested in listening to our story. Tell us the next story you would love to hear from us. Let's continue telling our story. Mwaura, with his always-present yellow t-shirt, would look on during these moments, shaking his head and muttering, "Kanavu ni mtoto wa kupigwa," which roughly translated to, "Kanavu is a child who needs a beating." The market women riding the bus would laugh until their stomachs hurt, but nobody could argue with the results. After its beating, Kanavu would roar back to life, clattering and shaking, but getting everyone where they needed to go. It wasn't just hills where Kanavu misbehaved. Sometimes, it would refuse to start when Mwatate wasn't in the mood to drive. There was one time, this is a story everyone in Mwangazi knows, when Mwatate fell ill and decided to stay home. His cousin, Kiptoo, thought he'd take over the route for the day, earn some quick cash. Kiptoo got the keys, climbed into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. Nothing. He twisted the key again. Not even a sputter. He pounded the steering wheel, tried to pull the door shut, but the door wouldn't budge either. Kanavu just sat there, completely silent like a stubborn old mule. Kiptoo, sweating and embarrassed, had to admit defeat. "Hii basi si kawaida," he muttered as he climbed down. "This bus is not normal." When Mwatate returned the next day, fresh and ready, Kanavu roared to life the moment he touched the key. People swore the bus had a soul, and Mwatate was the only one who could tame it. The routes Kanavu took were just as unpredictable as the bus itself. One day, it would be ferrying people through the open plains, where the sun burned hot and the wind blew dry. The next day, it would be cutting through the dense, mysterious forest where shadows loomed large, and everyone held their breath, half expecting a hyena or a leopard to leap out from the trees. Yet, rain or shine, forest or plain, Kanavu never faltered. It wasn't just passengers Kanavu carried either. Some days, it would act like a water truck, sloshing around containers of water from the river, its old engine groaning in protest but never breaking down. Other days, it transformed into a farm tractor, carrying sacks of maize and beans or dragging a plow through the fields as if it were the village's own tinga-tinga. Kanavu was a bus of all trades, and no one could quite figure out how it did all that without ever stopping at a petrol station. Now about Mwaura. If there was one thing everyone knew about him, it was that yellow t-shirt. It was like his trademark, his second skin. People joked that he even slept in it. But there was something else about Mwaura that made him unforgettable. He had a way of making even the dullest day seem lively. He'd crack jokes as he hopped up and down the aisles, tossing winks at the market women. Ukipanda Kanavu, maisha yako inachekesha, he'd say with a grin, meaning, if you board Kanavu, your life becomes funny. And it was true. No one ever had a dull trip on that bus. But despite his humor, Mwaura took his job seriously. He was always making sure Kanavu had something to drink from his battered old jerry can. What was in that jerry can? No one knew. Some said it was a special concoction of diesel and herbs. Others whispered that it was something far more mystical, a potion brewed by an ancient mechanic in a far-off village. But whatever it was, it kept Kanavu running, and Mwaura guarded it fiercely. One rainy afternoon, Kanavu was making its usual run through the forest. The rain had been pouring for hours, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. Most buses would have turned back, but not Kanavu. It plowed through the muck as if it were nothing. The market women, sitting in their usual seats, clutched their baskets of tomatoes and bananas, gossiping about the latest scandal in the village. But then, as they reached a particularly slippery bend, Kanavu did something it had never done before. It slipped. For a heart-stopping moment, the old bus tilted to one side, and everyone screamed, clutching onto their seats. Without missing a beat, Mwatate slammed on the brakes, threw the bus into neutral, and jumped out into the pouring rain. Mwaura followed, yellow t-shirt now soaked and clinging to his skinny frame. Together, they did the only thing they knew would work. They flogged Kanavu. Smack, smack, smack. 3 sharp hits to the side of the bus. The passengers, peering out from the windows, couldn't believe their eyes. But then, as if by magic, the bus slowly righted itself. Mwatate and Mwaura climbed back in, soaking wet but triumphant. Kanavu growled to life, and off they went, back down the road, as if nothing had happened. The market women erupted in laughter, their earlier panic forgotten. Only on Kanavu could something like this happen. By the time they reached the village, the sun had come out and the mud had dried into a hard crust on the bus's sides. The passengers disembarked, still chuckling about the day's adventure, and Mwatate leaned back in his seat, wiping his brow. Mwaura, as usual, was already hopping around, collecting the last few fares and making jokes about how Kanavu was stronger than any 4-legged animal in Mwangazi. And so the legend of Kanavu grew. People continued to talk about it in the markets, in the fields, and even in their homes. They whispered about the bus that never stopped for petrol, the driver who could control it with a whip, and the conductor who never changed his yellow shirt. And while no one could quite explain how or why Kanavu worked the way it did, they all agreed on one thing. Mwatate, Mwaura, and Kanavu made life in Mwangazi just a little more exciting, a little more fun, and a lot more mysterious.